Hello, I'm Mihai Zodian, and today we'll be speaking about Carl von Clausewitz. He was a major strategist and military theorist who lived during Napoleon times and a bit after, born in Prussia. He served in the Napoleon Wars, and then he basically taught strategy, military strategy. He wrote this book on war, which is unfinished, but it is very influential. When Prussia became a major power and united as Germany, he was considered like an inspiration. So he's important for both theoretical and practical reasons. Okay, so this is a summary. There is a short introduction with the main arguments, case studies. There are several details about what we will be speaking about today, like war as a duel, moderating factors, and so on, and conclusions. At the end of the video, we will have a better grasp of some concepts like what is war, abstract and limited or real war, and the relations between war and the politics. This video is based on the first chapter from On War, which is the most important chapter. Now, On War is not finished, and some part of it are final, and the others were kind of rewritten, retaught by Clausewitz, but he died before he had the chance to finish the book. So the book was published by his wife, Marie von Clausewitz, and it has several editions. Today we'll use the Peter Parrott and Michael Howard edition, which is considered very, very good. And sometimes it's considered better than the original because the translators are important as, let's say, strategists and students of strategy. I also want to thank Radu Kukuta for allowing me to develop this series of videos about based on a course which we work together for discuss. Okay, so why do we speak about Carl von Clausewitz? One reason why we speak about Carl von Clausewitz is that the war still matters. And you see here, there are two news. One is about the Strait of Hormuz, which Iran want to make a filter of on it or to check the ships. So this Strait of Hormuz has important economical value, and we see that prices are starting to climb again. So this affects us in real life too, in the daily life too. The other news is about Zelensky and a reaction to one of his statements. So it's about the war between the Russia and Ukraine, the aggression of Russia, and the peace deals. And this you see that here that war always takes part in a political context, in like say peace negotiations, its goals, and so on. And this theme that war is a political phenomenon is fundamental for Clausewitz, as we will see. So there are two reasons why we speak: because war can affect us in our daily life, and because war has a political phenomenon. Political is a political phenomenon. Okay, the main argument. So this we speak about the first chapter. One is that von Clausewitz is actually difficult to understand because he doesn't argue very straightforward, like introduction, development, and conclusions, and the conclusions following from his premises. He alternates between various points of view, and he moves from one and the other in a, like a logic philosophical progression. So you can quote Clausewitz for even contradictory ideas. So you must this is a text which must be read with care. Why? Because it's an influential text and sometimes it has practical effects like advising war. So we must be careful when we speak about classics and war because they can be used to just justify wars and they can be used to justify disasters. I will speak soon about World War One. Okay, so he relied on this type kind of version of dialectical reasoning, and by dialectical I mean contradiction. Okay. Now, his conclusions are summed as the first triad and the second triad. So Trinity. The first Trinity is composed of violence, hostility. This is the first element. Then is chance and probability, and the other is political rationality. The second triad or Trinity is derived from the first one. So the first one is kind of general, and the second one is more particular. It's about the people, the army, and the government. Now let's look at some cases. In World War One started with something called by Van Everett the cult of offensive. So people thought that the war will be ending soon, and that the war will be decided by a few battles. Now you see today, if you look at Iran, or if you look at the Russian aggression against Ukraine, people still think that war are easy to finish. So. And this idea of decisive battle or decisive action is still influential. And in Clausewitz's book on war, there are some arguments that support this idea. For example, that battle is decisive. So you can basically settle the war by winning battles, just by winning battles. The other example is World War II and total war. So World War II also was started as a in the idea that it will be a fast war and the military decision will be easy. It didn't turn out that way, and in Clausewitz we will see why. Also, there is a concept of total war, which means that the whole society takes part in war, and this is sometimes justified by Clausewitz's concept of absolute war, but they are different, as we will see soon. The third example is the Cold War. Because of nuclear weapons, all the wars were limited. There were tacit or sometimes explicit limits that war shouldn't allow to escalate to the nuclear level. So in this case, we have wars as political instruments, and they are limited by their goal, which is one of them is to avoid nuclear war. This has also a basis on von Clausewitz. The other example from Cold War is about arms races. Arms races illustrates two ideas which can be found in Clausewitz: the interaction of opposing forces and the role of force as a political also instrument. And the last example is the Napoleon Wars. So von Clausewitz, this is the book. Okay, this book is derived from von Clausewitz's interpretation of the Napoleonic Wars, which he witnessed, and he remembers some battles. He praises Napoleon as a kind of a god of war and of battles, and so on. And his theory is somehow a rationalization or a conclusion of this war. So it has a base on reality. Okay, so now let's look at some definition of war. Why definition? Because this definition is you can find them circulated around even today. For example, the first definition: war is an act of force to compel the enemy to do what we want. So war is about will and force. We use pressure, use coercion to leave the enemy without an alternative than to submit. Von Clausewitz actually talks about war as a duel, and the military goal of war is to disarm the enemy, to leave the enemy without any other option than to surrender. So this is the classical first definition of war. Now, this definition is has an absolute meaning, which means is war seen as itself in detachment from anything else in society. This war for Clausewitz, as we will see, is not the real war. This is just war in theory. Then there is another definition of war, which is about chance and danger and so on. The third definition is about the war as a political tool. Then the other definition of triads or trinities. One is an overall definition of how war as trinity looks in general. Like it's a combination of violence, hatred, and hostility, enmity, which is side one. The side two is chance and probability, because you have the fighters which struggle with each other. So this is the second, and the third is the logical, the reason of state reason, the political goals of the war. So taking this together, feelings, chance, and reason. And they are the trilogy, the Trinity. Okay, and that was the general trinity, and there is a second trinity which is about concrete manifestation, which is the modern state. So the people, the commander, and the army, this is the second, and the government. The people are the sentimental ones for von Clausewitz. The army is about chance and probability and courage, and the government is about reason. So it's a very top-down theory. It's uh, it's the witness of his age. Okay, so now is the complicated part. We will look a bit about at von Clausewitz, let's say dialectic. He starts with the idea that the war is like a duel, and like in any duel, there are like two sides. What we do, what our action interacts. So I hit, he parries, he hit me, I parry, and so on. And we have a complicated interaction. Okay, this interaction can get out of hand. So this means that if we study war in theory as an abstraction, and we know everything else, the war will escalate, will become more violent, more hostile, and it will reach an extreme. So taking account the means we have, there is an action and a reply. So this is the first extreme, the first tendency towards the extreme. The other tendency towards the extreme is that the enemy always has a vote. It's a kind of a saying, a common saying, which means what I do depends on my enemy's reaction. So he will react to me and I will react to him. So it's not something, Klaus will say that it's not action upon an inert force, it's upon a living force, so upon an enemy. So this is the second reason for escalation. And the third reason is that there's always a resistance. So the stronger the resistance, the most force I have to use, and it goes towards the extremes. Which, from Clausewitz's conclusion, which is very controversial today because of nuclear weapons, is that if we treat war as an abstraction, all wars will tend towards escalation, towards the absolute supreme value, which means today all wars are limited because of nuclear weapons. So we cannot really allow the war to go to its extreme. And this is the negative. And the positive conclusion is that we all, I mean, at least in democracies, the society must be involved in understanding warfare and controlling the military, because if you leave war on itself, it can get out of hand. Now, so this was war seen as an absolute. Now we will look at war, the real war. So from the theory, we go to the practice, towards history. Clausewitz argued that wars are never, they don't go to absolutes because of several reasons. Because first, they are not isolated in reality. They depend on politics, society, culture, and so on. They are not one-time very decisive action. So military operation take time, and even if you lose a war, you may have a second chance. So in reality, war doesn't tend towards extreme. It varies. So some wars may be decisive and they may be total, others are not. The next step in this dialectical progression, it's about war, real war, as a play of probability and danger. And these make war imperfect, defined by uncertainty. And he also emphasized that courage is a value. When you don't know a lot of things, you must reply with courage. So this is kind of important today, when we also went to a period of uncertainty. There's a lot of things we don't know, and a lot of things which can go wrong. And von Clausewitz advises that we need courage. Okay, the next step after probabilities, war is also a political instrument. One reason is that politics, so the national interest, for example, or whatever the community interests are, feudal interests, for example, they define the war. So if it's a war for, let's say, defensive or an offensive war, or war to promote democracy or humanitarian intervention and so on, all these depend on politics. And politics sometimes define the operational goal of war. For example, Clausewitz speaks about if you want to conquer a province and you start a war to get a province, this is the goal of the war. If you want something more, the military goal of the war is wider. And because there are many political reasons, there's also diversity of war. So let's look. We started first with war as duel. Then we notice the contrary idea that in reality war is not actually like a duel. It's something more complex, and this complexity comes from many sources. One is this violence, which is defining for war, but it's not the only element. The other is this the probability, the uncertainty. We don't know a lot. Von Clausewitz launched this use this concept of friction, which comes from physics, from mechanics. Friction is the thing which stops the movement, which slows the movement. So in war, friction is about all the things that make a plan to go wrong. So you start to imagine itself that the war will be in a way, you plan for that, and then you notice that there is fog, that some people don't understand the orders, that intelligence is imperfect. Von Clausewitz, intelligence always not very good and not always reliable, so we must be careful towards intelligence. Okay, so all of these make war a play of chance. And the last part is the war is a political instrument. All these elements make the trinity. So or the triad or the trilogy. So the first element is violence and passion, the second is probability, and the third is political reason. And somehow Clausewitz went from one idea to the other, and then tried to integrate all this idea in a whole. So all these elements together make up the, let's say, the overall conception of war from Clausewitz. So he said the war is more than a chameleon. I mean, war is more than something which has many variants. It's also contradictory. So to understand the war, you must move between violence, chance, and reason. So it's a combination of all. So this is war in general, contrary to war and uh, historical context, let's say. And to this general trinity, there is a second trinity which is more institutional. There are the people who make up the passional part, the army who is about probability, courage, and so on, and government which is about reason. This is a very top-down conception point of view, and it's understandable because Clausewitz was written in an era where you have some tendency towards democratization, like the French Revolution, but even the French Revolution ended up in an empire. So there was a combination between, let's say, people, revolution, and so on, and authoritarianism, dictatorship. Okay, so the world was still different from today. Now, what we need to understand about von Clausewitz is that it's very difficult, and this difficulty actually made him more discussed, and somehow it helped with his, let's say, his popularity. Uh, in the beginning, he was often understood as a writer who argued in favor of decisive battles. So they, on war, there's a long chapter about battles and so on. But this isn't the unfinished part of on war. So we still don't know the final, the definitive point of view of von Clausewitz. We can use the first chapter and several other smaller sections from on war to deduce it. But what we saw in the first chapter, that we saw that his reasoning is indirect, dialectical, and he moves from an idea to his opposite. Then he integrates contradictory ideas in his trinity, and then he comes from his trinity to a more concrete institutional manifestation. Uh, his trinity is very general, and is still used today to define conventional warfare between states. Sometimes it is extended towards conflicts against non-state actors, but when people speak about Trinitarian war, they mean von Clausewitz with the government, the army, and the people. So these are the second Trinity. Mm, it's also important because he was influenced by romantic ideas about the limits of reason and the values or the importance of passion. So in his theory, passion are important, and also the reason is limited because we don't know everything. So there are two limits to reason. One, it comes from the interaction in the multiplicity of events, which is an informational limit, and the other limit is reason as a faculty, as an ability, has s- some weak points, and one is that well, is limited by passion. His idea is that you cannot make a perfect plan for war, and that in war always things can go wrong, and all of this is summed up by the idea of friction. So war is defined by violence, by chance, by some reason, but it's not, it's neither, it's somewhere in between. And he attempts to navigate between these three poles. So this is basically a quote from him. And when we study war, we need to take into account the hostility, the element of chance, and the element of reason. So we shouldn't treat war as something very easy or something which we can control. We always must be very, very prudent when we speak about war. And another idea is that war is a political phenomenon. So this is the reasonable part. And because war is a political phenomenon, uh, even civilians must study, must know something about war, because they are basically either deciding whether a war should be fought or not, or at least offering the resources or supporting the cost. So there's basically a democratic point of view which is somehow different from Clausewitz, but it's related to his idea that war is a political phenomenon, that we as a democracy must be also interested in understanding war because we want to avoid, so let's say, the negative effects, and because war, as we saw, it affects our life. Okay, so based on this whole section, whole video, there are several issues which can be debated. For example, whether von Clausewitz was a promoter of brute force or he was more nuanced. My argument is that he was more nuanced, but there are also different points of view. The other is about the absolute and total war, and whether the under nuclear weapons war tends toward extreme, and that we should be very careful with that. The other is whether his idea is mostly written from the period of nation states, and globalization may change that. From here, we may ask whether von Clausewitz is still relevant or not. I think that up to a point, especially when states use force, his idea that war can always go wrong is important today, because there are many other people who think that force can be controlled with precision, and sometimes people who think like that start wars, which obviously go wrong. The other and the last idea is his influence upon deterrence theory. Uh, Deterrence theory basically argues that war can be not war force, and some types of war can be limited and can be used as a mean to stop wider and more general forms of war. And his emphasis upon a war as a political phenomenon is important for to understand control the use of force and some version of deterrence theory. So you can deter either by showing you have the will to fight, or that you have a very wide popular basis, and up to a point you must be careful that there is an element of chance in the use of force, and even this in shelling interpretation. Sorry, without one, uh, you can use to deter the other side. So these are the elements of von Clausewitz. Thank you for listening to me.